Let's talk about task 22. Task 22 is about recognizing errors and then correcting errors, and you'd also have to probably, in most cases, be able to duplicate those errors yourself. So there's 6 errors that an examiner can ask you to identify and then correct and to perform. They're going to pick 3 of those 6, so you need to be prepared for all 6, obviously. The 6 are, you've got slack, so at some point in an error you're going to see slack. You're going to have a poor stop. You're going to have 2 different kinds of tailing loops, one caused by creep and one caused by a misapplication of power, too much wrist, and tracking. So those are your 6 errors. The way we're going to do this, I'm going to do one and I'm going to see, you're going to see, I'm just going to play like I'm the examiner and you're the student, and I want you to pick out the error before I tell you what it is. And then we'll go through how you could have picked it out, what you're looking for, and so on. A couple of things that are really important. One is always use Bruce Richards' system. It's a brilliant system. Use that system. What you want to do is look at the loop first, then look at the rod, and then look at the body, and then correct the body, which will correct the rod, which will correct the loop. And you want to do that. Be careful to do that. Don't jump to a conclusion based on what you see in a loop. That can easily send you astray and have you fail this test. Remember, if you fail this, you fail the test, even if the rest of it was perfect. All you've got to do is fail one of these and you fail the test. So be very careful. Ask the examiner to look at it a couple of times. Could you do that again, please? Could you do that again? First time, look at the loop. Second time, look at the rod. Third time, look at the body and make sure the body is doing what you assumed it was doing, because it's not always that clear. The other thing, use the process of elimination. In the process of elimination, all you're doing is, you know, if you're seeing pretty good loops and there's no tail, and it's good straight loops, then it probably isn't a poor stop and it's not too much wrist. So you can use the process of elimination. We're going to go through that when we go through each one, but that's an important factor because some of them, like a poor stop and slack, can be sort of confusing depending on how the examiner does it. So, but if you follow Bruce Richards' system and you use the process of elimination, you won't have any problem. For each one of these, I would suggest you pick 2 ways to correct it that you're really confident with, that you've actually used, which brings me to the next point. Man, you need to get out and teach. You need to go find some people to teach, so you're not just assuming through theory what might work and what might not work. I'm going to, this and the next lesson on all the different kinds of tools that I have in my tool chest, you can pick, I mean, there are dozens of different things you can do to help people correct errors. You need to find some that you really believe in, that you know will work in for most students, and then have a slew of other ones as backups in case those don't work. So make sure you're doing this and practice this exam, practice this test, practice this last one. If you can get somebody to do these, and you're going to have to see what they look like in real time to figure out how you're going to do this when you take the test. Whatever you do, don't get to task 22 and fail it. That'd just be a crying shame. So here we go. We're going to start off with the first one, and I'm going to have you see what you think it is, and then we'll explain how you could have figured it out. One last thing that's really important. In many of these tasks from 16 through 22, your examiners may have different opinions about how they want it done. What I would suggest you do for 22 is, once you've identified the error, you need to ask the examiner, would you like to be my student and I will correct it like you're a student, or would you like me to just explain what I would do? Because some examiners want you to actually, they want to be the student, they want to actually physically, they want you to show them exactly what you would do. Other examiners may be perfectly satisfied just explaining what you would do. So ask the examiner before you start how you want to deal with these different problems. Error number 1. So that's pretty obvious, too much wrist. My wrist was going back and forth. You should have picked that out. So now, and if what you've done is you looked at the big loop, and then you looked at the rod, you see it's too big of a casting arc for the amount of line, and so now what you see is you get down here and you say, oh man, too much wrist. Be careful, because watch this. Same casting arc, same big loop, but no excessive wrist. I'm making all my rotation through my body. So if I wanted to show you too much slack, for instance, I might, or a poor stop, I might be able to do this. Poor stop. I should be stopping here and here, and instead I'm stopping here and here. But there's no wrist. You need to get down and watch the wrist. Get all the way to the body before you make a decision. If this is what the examiner did, and you said too much wrist, you just failed the test. So you need to go from the loop to the rod to the body, and every single time do that. Now let's talk about some things. Pick 2 or 3. I like to put a noodle in the front and the back and tell people don't hit the noodle or just barely tap it. Okay, another thing you can do is you can ask a person to stand here, put your rod right there. Okay, we're gonna play like this is 12 o'clock, 11 o'clock, 10 o'clock, and 9 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, and 3 o'clock. I want you to make sure you stop at 2 and stop at 10. With that amount of line, that might be good. Or just shorten your piece of pie. Make your pie smaller, make your pie smaller, make your pie smaller. Good, right there. That's something you might be able to do. Have them look at the background. I want you to stop when your rod tip gets to the top of that pine tree. In the back, I want you to stop when your rod tip gets to the top of that palm tree. So they're gonna go back and forth and look and stop. Those are some things. There's some other stuff you can do, simulcasting. Student stands over behind me a little bit and to my right so they can see my casting shoulder. Both of us have the same amount of line down. Both of us have exactly in the same place. And I say, okay, just follow me. And we simulcast. A couple other things you can do. You can strap the sleeve or put the rod tip butt into the sleeve of the shirt. That's going to prevent them from using too much wrist. You can strap it with a Velcro strap. You can change the grip to a 4-finger grip. It's more difficult to bend your wrist very far with a 4-finger grip. I don't like some of these because they end up being crutches, which will hurt you later on, but there's certainly things to do over the short term. So you can do that. One of the ones I really like is I really find that if you make a person or you ask them to just increase their stroke length, if they increase their stroke length, they tend not to go down and forward and back. This is when you get too much wrist, when you have a very short stroke length. If you have somebody increase the stroke length, that doesn't happen. So those are all possible things, and there's some others too that you'll see in the next lesson. Error number 2. So now, what you should have figured out, even without having to move or ask me to do it again, is by virtue of process of elimination, there were no tails, it's not too much wrist, it's not a poor stop, there's no slack, that was it, that's 5 things. It's only got to be one thing left, and that's a tracking error. From where you were standing, you couldn't see this. But that's what I was doing. So when you see nice loops and you're standing on the side, you better ask that examiner, okay, can you stop for just a second and do this again? Walk to the front, walk to the back so you can see this. In other words, on that particular error, things are going to look pretty good if you're away from it on the side. And the farther away you are, the harder it is to see it. You need to get on the front or the back to see it for sure. And then you're going to have to see the rod doing this. So the rod does this. Now, what's the hand doing? It's rotating out. So that's what you need to correct. So make sure you understand that if you see nothing apparently wrong, it's very likely it's going to be tracking, and you need to go watch and you need to verify that it's tracking. So let's talk about what you would do to correct a tracking error. One, and if you go back to the tracking video we have in chapter 1, the fundamentals, you're going to see one of the videos is just about casting up against the wall. So if I can find a wall, that's a really good one. Tim Lawson's way to do it is pretty good too. He's got a tape all the way in front and all the way in back. He has somebody start with no slack, just pick it up and drop it right behind them, and then drop their rod and they do it, and then turn around and look, take out the slack, do it again, and what you should see is your line should be going right across, right parallel to the tape. If the line's curving at the end, then you've got a tracking error. So I like Tim Lawson's. Tim Lawson's is really good too. The other thing is just have people watch their hand and try to get their hand to go back and forth in a groove. And then the last one that I like quite a bit is just tell a person, look, play like there's a clothesline right there. Just play like there's a wall or a clothesline and try to bring your rod tip back and forth. And again, in all of these things, using some pantomiming will really help. So first thing I do is have them do this or this, just with the hand. None of this. They're not rotating, it's back and forth. Then use a noodle. Then use a rod without a line, and then put the rod and the line together. So you can do a lot of those kinds of things. Error number 3. You can't really see this, but what happened was at the very end of the last cast, we were doing tracking error like this. And what the examiner did, set the line down like this. And what happened is he's got a bunch of slack right in front. You can't see it because we're not there with the video, but trust me, there's a ton of slack right here. So what you need to do is you need to watch. And if they start, every single time they start to show you an error, make really sure there's no slack in that line on their pickup and their laydown. If on their laydown they created slack, that's your first clue. You can also do the same thing. This is another way they may produce slack. They'll have it straight, and they'll be talking and say, okay, error number 3. There's your slack, tons of slack. You got slack. There's one other way they could conceivably do it, and that's to wait too long on the front and the back. So it could be this: slack, 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 slack. You can see that's not too much wrist. It's not a poor stop. It's not tailing loops. It's not tracking. That's got to be slack. So again, you're going to have to go through it and just be calm. Take your time. Have them do it again. You can see the slack in this. The most common way they do it is to just do it this way. On a previous laydown, they just put the slack in. So that's how you're going to discuss that one. And without being able to see this, I couldn't really have you test yourself. But that's what you're looking for with too much slack. A couple of different ways of doing it, and it would really help you to use the process of elimination. So now let's talk about how could we correct these errors. To me, slack is the most important of all of Gemmel's principles or essentials. If you've got no slack and you move your rod, your fly is going to go somewhere. And as a guide, I can just tell you that no slack is by far the most important thing. The cast may not be pretty, but it's going to go somewhere. If you have slack, none of the other principles even apply, in my view. You don't have to profess that view, but that's my view. Slack is the most important of them. Get rid of the slack, which means you have to move the fly. So my suggestion to you when you're talking to your examiner is demonstrate. This is how I would teach people about slack. When you have a fly that isn't moving when the rod starts to move, then you've got slack. So we need to make sure that that fly moves or that yarn moves when the rod starts to move. So we're going to do some drills to demonstrate that thing. We could do the line drill. We can do Tim Lawson's drill. There's a lot of drills you can do to create, if it's pause, if it's a problem with pause, then hey, you're going to have to shorten your pause down. Now, just tell people when to come forward. Watch their fly to make sure it's coming forward. When they do a pick up and lay down, and they lay it down, if they have a poor stop and lay it down, oftentimes it will create slack. But that's not the biggest issue. The biggest issue is slack to start with. So what do you have to do? You have to stop properly so that your line goes forward. That's going to be important. So now you're going to stop. Now your line goes forward, and I've got a pretty good headwind into me right here. So those are the kinds of things you can do. There's a bunch of other stuff you can do too with a noodle. Again, boom, boom, boom. Hand, noodle, rod, simulcasting. It depends on where the slack is in the system. That's going to determine, in that particular case where you've got slack piled up on the laydown, the problem is probably A, you may not have had enough force on a forward cast, and B, you probably had a poor stop, which caused that slack. So you're going to have to correct those two things. Of course, one of the easiest ways to get rid of slack in a lot of those situations, especially when the line's already on the ground with slack, is to simply roll cast it. So I just roll cast. And that gets rid of, even if you're here, tell the person, look, if you realize you stopped and you've created a ton of slack right here, then all you're doing is bring it back and roll cast it. Get rid of the slack, now you can pick it up and cast it. So there's lots of different ways of dealing with slack. You can, if you need to, you can pull line back, but boy, that's very inefficient. So try not to do that one, but there's a lot of ways to get rid of slack. Okay, that's a poor stop. In none of those was slack a big issue. Even on the laydown, if I'd have done it this way, a little bit sloppy stop, my line straightens out, so there's no slack. So if there's no slack, and in the first example, this was not too much wrist. If you look at my wrist, you'll see my wrist is not excessively moving. I'm creating all that rotation with my arm and my body. So that would be a better stop. So let's talk about ways to prevent a better stop. A poor stop is very similar to too much wrist. You're going to use a lot of the same techniques. You could use the noodles in the front and the back. You can use the visual references. You can strap the wrist and tell people stop at 10 o'clock, 2 o'clock. A lot of those same kinds of things for poor stop. Those are all tried and true methods. And then of course simulcasting and pantomiming, all that sort of stuff, making sure they understand the clock and they need to use a smaller piece of pie. And the other thing I like to do is go back to the line drill, boom, boom, and actually have them stop on 2 cones, and that's in chapter 1 as well. Have them stop on 2 cones and get them to understand that usually the firmer the stop, the more abrupt the stop, the better the cast is going to be. So come and stop and stop and stop, instead of just kind of waving it back and forth without much of a stop. So part of a lot of what happens is that it looks like a poor stop, and it is, but inappropriate acceleration, too wishy-washy of acceleration leads to what's going to be what looks like a poor stop. And the wishier-washier your acceleration, the more abrupt your stop has to be. Error number 5. If you're using Bruce Richards' system, you're always looking at a loop first. So you saw a bunch of good loops, and then all of a sudden you saw a tail. It was pretty obvious. Once you see that tail, you've got to ask him to do it again, and then you've got to start watching the rod. And if you'd have watched that rod, there was no creep. That rod stayed back here until the line was completely behind it. It started casting, and there was a flick at the end. Right at the end, there was a flick. And if you watch that, the rod tip pretty much stops in the same place it had in the previous false cast. So that was obviously a tail caused by an inappropriate application of power. There was no creep. So if there's no creep, it's got to be the other one. So watch for creep. That's the easiest thing to identify. And if it's not creep, then it's got to be an inappropriate application of power. I would suggest you go back to task number 3 and task number 18 and look at those videos so you get an idea of how to see how these things are done. And then you better practice them because they could ask you to do it. As far as correction for that, I like simultaneous casting. Well, I tell you, that really helps because people, it's hard to do it. It's amazing how that really works. The other thing I do is go back to the paintbrush drill, just nice smooth acceleration. Go back to the line drill, do that. And one other couple little things I do is you can have them turn around and watch. Turn around and watch, and then when you come forward, just nice smooth cast, just a smooth cast. Or don't even have them turn around and watch, but just concentrate on this. Tell them they're throwing a ball, just throwing a ball, just like this, or a dart, or that water off the paintbrush. So those are things you can do. Or you can take their hand if you need to. We'll talk about that in one of the next lessons, but you can take your hand and ask them, and we'll go through the procedure of how to do that, and then just have them close their eyes and feel it. The other thing, just have them close their eyes. Close their eyes and they can feel that cast. And many of these things we've already done, we can use those same techniques. Hand on hand, feel it, close your eyes, simultaneous, but those are all things you figure out. You need to go someplace and you need to start teaching somebody. And when you see an inappropriate application of power, which won't take you too long to find, somebody in a group of 3 or 4 is going to do it for sure, then what you're going to do is you're going to figure out how would you go about correcting that. And then when you go to the exam, you can have faith that what you're telling him is something that actually works. So again, make sure you're asking the examiner, would you want me to explain it to you, or do you want me to actually show you with you being a student? Error number 6. So that one you should have easily seen that it's creep. You could watch the rod move forward. It was just this every time. It sort of bounced creep, but obviously creep. So you could see that rod tip move forward. So now you know it's not any of the others. It's going to be a tailing loop, an obvious tailing loop caused by creep. So how do we correct it? One of the ways I do it is I have people watch the rod tip and just watch it and stop. Just watch it and stop before they start coming forward. Watch it and stop and wait until they see the line straighten out and then come forward. Wait until they line to see the line, because this is a really hard one to break. The other thing I'll do sometimes is they'll make their back cast and start to creep or start to bounce, and I'll just grab it just like this with my fingers, just like that. Hold it just for a second and then let it go. Just like that. I'll do that a lot. And that seems to be a really interesting way. It'll screw up their forward cast a lot of times, but it's going to stop them from creeping. Another thing you can do for people who are more coordinated, and I don't do this very often because I think teaching drift is relatively difficult, but certainly if you have an intermediate caster or an advanced caster that's guilty of some kind of creep, drifting back, just drifting, mostly translational drift, unless you're shooting line in the back, translational drift is all you need. Just drift. Just stop and follow it back, and we have a video on drifting in chapter number 2, so you might try that. Other than that, simultaneous casting, again, pantomiming, the line drill. What you'll see, even on the line drill, a person will come back, they'll stop their rod, and as soon as they stop their rod, they do this. Even on a line drill, even when they're just letting it sit. So what you need to do is get them to do this and just stop. What you can do is stand right here, and what I'll do sometimes is stand behind them and just put a noodle over them. When they stop, the noodle stop, they hit that noodle, so I'd have a noodle over there like this. They make that stop, and as soon as they make that stop, I put a noodle right here to keep them from doing that little bounce creep back. I think this is one of the more difficult things to correct, is the bounce creep. It's very, very common. Or the whole idea of just stopping and starting so slowly that nothing happens. Your rod just doesn't bend and then they go. So be prepared for either one of those two as a demonstration. And hopefully your examiner, and this is a hard thing for examiners to do, is to really significantly differentiate between creep and, in some cases, an inappropriate application of power. Those two things can get kind of muddled. But most examiners are really good about they're really good about doing this so it's clear for you to figure it out. So in conclusion, I'll just say the same things I said at the beginning. Hey, make sure that you're using Bruce Richard's system. Watch that line. Just watch the line to start with. Then watch the rod, then watch the body, which means it may take, you ask your examiner to do it 2 or 3 times. Once you've identified it, clearly articulate, this is what I think it is. Then what you can do is ask again. Do they want you to mimic it? If they do, then you're going to have to mimic it. Many examiners don't ask you to do it yourself. But if they do, you got to be prepared to do all of those easily. The last thing you're going to do is you're going to point out 2 or 3 ways that you would correct that error, and to be ready for a couple of other secondary ways that you might correct the error. But I would show them 2 or 3 and then ask if they would like to see some more. If they want to see some more, have another 2 or 3. But have the first couple that you really believe in. Be quick, be concise, and don't just blabber. It's just like the other tasks, 16 through 21. Be as concise as you can. This should not be more than a couple of sentences long for each correction. I would do this. That's it. Then I would do this. Have them watch. Have them watch. Have them watch. I would do the line drill. That's it. So have the examiner do it and explain to the examiner. This is what I see a lot of people do. On the line drill, they come in and they bounce back. They come and they bounce. They kind of cock to start their next cast. A lot of people do that. They cock. They come and then they cock. So what I would do is have to stop that, but I want you to hit that cone and stay on that cone until it's time to go. Stay on the cone, or put a noodle in front of them and stop it. So there's lots of different ways, but you've got to figure out the way you do it and pay attention to your mentor and lots of other information that can help you develop some other ideas on how to correct some of these faults. Make sure that the examiner knows that you're perfectly willing to have them be a student and you correct it.